Hey everyone, I'm Rabbi Lehrfield, and this is 0%. Tonight, Jews around the world will celebrate Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer literally translates as the 33rd day of the Omer. We'll talk a little bit next week about what the Omer period really is all about, but very simply and briefly, it's the count from Passover to the holiday of Shavuos. And we count 49 days between Passover and Shavuos, and Lag BaOmer, which is the 18th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, is the 33rd day of the Omer. So Lamed Gimel 33, BeOmer of the Omer. It's the 33rd day of the Omer. There were several things historically that happened on Lag BaOmer. Chronologically, the first thing of note that happened on Lag BaOmer is on Lag BaOmer, tradition tells us, was the first day that Noah went into the Teva, into the ark. So during the great flood, where God, so to speak, regretted creating the world, and Noah and his family are saved, he goes into the Teva, he goes into the ark on Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is also the day that when the Jews were in the desert between leaving Egypt and making their way to the land of Israel, that the manna, the mystical food from heaven, began to fall. Lag BaOmer is also the day that the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying. We'll talk a little bit more about that story if you're not familiar with it next week. Now, at face value, that sounds wonderful and certainly sounds like a cause for celebration. But when you take a step back and you realize the only reason why they stopped dying is because there were no people left and all the students had died, that makes you really wonder why we're celebrating. Why would we celebrate the day that they stopped dying? It's the day that the last one died. They all died out. That's not a cause for celebration, but perhaps it is. I think we see a really important growth mindset idea in this concept. Why are we celebrating the fact that the students all stopped dying when they all died out? The remarkable thing about Rabbi Akiva is what he did next. And to appreciate this, we have to understand who Rabbi Akiva was. This is a man who became one of the greatest sages who ever lived, to the extent that when Moses prophetically gets a glimpse of Rabbi Akiva, he says to the Almighty, "Why are you giving the Torah to me, giving it through me? Why not give it to Rabbi Akiva?" This is who the man was. But at the age of 40, was a shepherd who was completely ignorant. He didn't even know the Aleph Beis. He didn't even know how to read and write. And one day, he's minding his own business, and he sees, as he's sitting by a brook, that there's a rock that has a hole that was carved out. And he wonders where that hole came from. How could a hole be carved into a rock? And he notices that there's a steady trickle of water coming from above. And that water is dripping drop after drop after drop. And he realizes that it's the water that carves through the rock. And he wonders how that's possible. How can water, which is soft, carve a rock that is hard? And he says to himself, if water, which is soft, can penetrate something so hard, how much more so can words of Torah, which are like fire, make an impression on my heart, which is soft? And that was a turning point in Rabbi Akiva's life. Then and there, he committed himself to study Torah, and he went on to become the greatest sage who ever lived. For those, by the way, who are familiar with the organization Eish HaTorah, the name Eish HaTorah, Rav Noach Weinberg named after this story with Rabbi Akiva, because of the idea that Rabbi Akiva came up with, that if water which is soft can pierce this rock that is hard, how much more so can the Eish HaTorah, the fire of Torah, pierce his heart which is soft. And Rav Noach Weinberg named the organization Eish HaTorah because this was the message he was trying to give over. Which drop made the hole in the rock? What Rabbi Akiva realized was that it was all of them. One drop of water by itself does almost nothing. It's undetectable. By itself, it seems like it is contributing nothing to the process. And yet, Without every one of those drops, that hole wouldn't be there. That crevice was carved into the rock because of the consistency of the dripping. It's the drop one day after another, after another, after another. The constant consistency is what created that hole. And that's the Jewish view of spirituality. We understand that achieving great things doesn't come through dramatic bursts of insight. If you had a torrential downpour of water, it would accomplish nothing because experiences are fleeting. It's like we discussed in last week's episode. Inspiration by definition doesn't last. It goes away, it dissipates. Consistent striving, consistent work, consistency, the small triumphs that add up drop after drop, those are the ones that ultimately create true transformation. When Rav Noach Weinberg was looking for a name for his organization, he named it after this story, this episode, because it teaches us that, number one, it's never too late to start our journey. No matter what our background is, if Rabbi Akiva at the age of 40 can begin and become the greatest sage who ever lived, what can I do if I change and I start right now? Forget about the excuses. Forget about where I come from. Forget about what my upbringing is. Forget about what I've learned to this point and what I haven't learned. No excuses. Today, I can begin the process of learning. Today, I can become Rabbi Akiva. But even more than that, it shows us what we can accomplish with consistency. What we can accomplish when we focus on day in and day out, when we put in the effort. It's not about who I am. It's about the effort that I put in to become the person I know that I can become. So now imagine Rabbi Akiva going from completely ignorant shepherd at the age of 40 to the greatest sage who ever lived. And then he builds up a reputation. He builds up students who he dedicates his life to teaching until he has 24,000 of them. And then in a matter of weeks, he watches as 24,000 of his students die, one after another after another. Imagine the devastation. If it was me, at that point, I would throw in the towel and I would say, God, what do you want from me? After all the effort he put in to become who he was, after all the effort he put in to educate these students, and now everything is gone. Everything he spent his entire life working on and working so hard to accomplish is now taken away from him. But do you know what Rabbi Akiva does? He begins over again. And therefore, Lag BaOmer is the day that celebrates Rabbi Akiva beginning the process again. And everything that we have Jewishly comes from the students of Rabbi Akiva. After the death of those 24,000 students, Rabbi Akiva begins over again, and he begins with 5 new students. And those 5 new students are the source of everything we have today. What greater episode, what greater story to teach us that failure is not a permanent condition. When we look at heroes in Judaism, we don't look at the people who were born to greatness. We look at people like Rabbi Akiva, self-made people who became who they were through hard work and effort. And Rabbi Akiva is the one who teaches us this lesson, this growth mindset idea that failure is not a permanent condition. He watched the demise and decimation of 24,000 of his students. But that wasn't enough to make him quit. He realized that failure was not a permanent condition and that he can and he must begin again. And that's exactly what he did. Lag BaOmer is also a celebration of one of his prized students. One of the 5 students that he started over again was Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, otherwise known as the Rashbi, which is an acronym for his name. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And Lag BaOmer is the day that he died. It's the anniversary of his death, his Yortzeit. Now, who was Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and why would we be celebrating on a day that he died? Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was one of the sages of the Talmud, who famously hid in a cave for 13 years when the Romans outlawed the study of Torah. And he hid in this cave with his son. And during this time, Jewish legend has that he was inspired by the prophet Eliyahu Hanavi. And it's at this time that he came across many of the mystic teachings that we have as the basis of Kabbalah today. Now, these teachings were written down in a book called the Zohar. Now, the Zohar, according to some, was written by Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. According to many others, it was inspired by the teachings of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Now, why would the day of his death be a time of celebration? So that comes to something actually written down in the Zohar itself. In the Zohar, it writes that on the day that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was to leave the world, his friends came and gathered in his room, and he said to them that now is a time of favor. It's an auspicious time, and I can reveal things from the metaphysical, spiritual world that I have not been able to reveal until now. And all that day, the Zohar records, the fire never left his room, and there was no one who was able to approach as the light and the fire were surrounding him. And after he passed away, they came to bury him, and they saw that the fire flew into the air and danced before him. And a voice was heard from heaven saying, "Come and gather every year for the Hilula, the Yortzeit, the anniversary of Rav Shimon bar Yochai." So this was a day that a tremendous amount of spiritual energy was brought into the world, and spiritual knowledge was shared with the world, which has trickled down to us. This is one of the reasons why we celebrate Lag BaOmer with fires, with bonfires. I remember when I was living in Israel, children would spend weeks leading up to Lag BaOmer collecting any bit of wood that they can find, whether it was a cabinet or a couch that was put out, on the curb for someone else to take, or crates, any bit of wood that you can find, you name it. Israeli children collect it, and they collect it for months, and they all try to build the biggest bonfire they can. What was amazing was looking at the scene of Jerusalem the night of Lag BaOmer, several hours after all the bonfires. And it looked like one of those scenes out of a movie where the world came to an end and there was like one lone survivor, and as he's walking around, you see like all of these smoking and smeltering piles. That's what it looks like the night leading into the morning after Lag BaOmer. The entire country is on fire. It's remarkable. But why do we celebrate with fire? So one reason, the most simple reason, is because as we saw in the Zohar, on the last day of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's life, his room was surrounded by fire. After his death, there was a pillar of light and fire that seemed to fly and dance around him after he died. And it was a time that he revealed the Zohar, or at least the teachings of the Zohar, which is the fire that illuminates the world and the fire that illuminates life itself. But there's something deeper. What is fire, and why do we use it to celebrate Lag BaOmer? There's a fascinating medrash, a story that was passed down orally for generations until it was later written down in the time of the Talmud. And the medrash explains Abraham's introduction, so to speak, to God. Jewish wisdom teaches us that Abraham intuited the fact that there is a creator on his own, that he himself came to an awareness and an understanding of God's existence. And because of that, the Almighty revealed himself to Abraham and began a relationship with him. And the Medrash records the following analogy to explain Abraham coming to an awareness of the Creator on his own. It says, imagine a man who's walking down the street, and he sees a mansion, a beautiful mansion that's engulfed in flames. And he says to himself, there must be an owner to the house. And therefore the owner comes out and says, oh, hey, I'm the owner of the house. And so too, Abraham, because he looked around at the world and said there must be an owner to the world, and because of that, the owner of the world, the creator of the world, introduced himself to Abraham and said, hi, here I am, nice to meet you. Now, I'd heard this analogy several times as a child, as a teenager, and I never really thought too deeply into it. until one day I was really troubled by it. Because if you think about it, the analogy makes absolutely no sense. If you see a house that's on fire, that's not a sign, a proof of ownership. If anything, that's abandonment. Right? The very fact that the house is on fire tells me that no one is watching this house, that no one's responsible for the house. Why on earth does the Medrash use that as the example? You could have, why are you being such a pyro? You could have given over the exact same idea without the fire. A man is walking down the street. He sees a beautiful mansion. He says to himself, there's no way that this beautiful mansion could have been built without an architect and a builder and a process. This house couldn't have just happened by itself. There must have been someone who built it, someone who created it. That would have been fine with me. And then somebody says, hey, by the way, I'm the owner of the house, or I'm the builder. And so too, God comes to Abraham and he tells him, I'm the creator of the world, because Abraham realized on his own that there's no way that this world, as intricate as it is, could have happened on its own. Why the fire? But I think we're looking at fire from the wrong perspective. Fire is not just destructive. It's not even just a source of heat and light. Fire is something much deeper. What happens if I take a chair and I throw it in the fire? It gets bigger. Why? If I want more water, I need to add more water. Why does throwing the chair in the fire make the fire bigger? I didn't add more fire. I added something else. What fire shows me is that the chair, even though it has a function to be able to sit on, has a latent energy that I can't see or perceive with my senses. And fire brings that out. The fire gets bigger. It shows me that that energy was there all along. It shows me that everything has an essence deep inside that is so much deeper than the external facade that I notice. It shows me, to quote my teacher, that every davar, everything, is medaber. It speaks the davar Hashem, the word of its creator. That everything, no matter what, has depth. The practical challenge of Lag BaOmer is to see the potential energy in every object and every person, instead of being fooled by the facade of the external. That's the message of Lag BaOmer, and that's the message of fire. So perhaps that's why we have fire in Lag BaOmer. We'll talk a little bit more about this message next week as we explore the Omer in general. Have an enlightening Lag BaOmer, a wonderful day, and we'll see you back here next week.